Okay, guys, this is my HIPAA education PowerPoint. So you see it says HIPAA education and then my name, Christopher Jones, on there. And then HIPAA education strategies. I would set up new employee training by documenting all of the various components of the HIPAA privacy and security rules so that key information is not left out. As HIPAA is federal law, it is of utmost importance to be as concise as possible when discussing its provisions. Visual learning, in my opinion, would allow employees to understand why it is important to comply with HIPAA's regulations using images and graphics. What is HIPAA? HIPAA stands for the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. This law was authorized in 1996 and initially mainly dealt with insurance coverage. However, in 2003, the privacy rule took effect, safeguarding the privacy of protected health information, or PHI. 2 years later, in 2005, the security rule took effect, requiring facilities to secure electronic PHI or ePHI. What if I don't comply with HIPAA? Not complying with HIPAA is against the law. Civil and criminal penalties can be used against facilities and individuals not compliant with HIPAA. Individual did not know that he or she violated HIPAA. $100 per violation with annual maximum of $25,000. HIPAA violation due to reasonable cause and not due to willful neglect. That $1,000 per violation with annual maximum of $100,000. HIPAA violation due to willful neglect, but violation was corrected within the required time period. $10,000 per violation with annual maximum of $250,000. HIPAA violation due to willful neglect with violation not corrected. $50,000 per violation with annual maximum of $1 million. So as you can see, the penalties increase depending on the severity. These are severe noncompliance penalties. Covered entities and specified individuals who knowingly obtain or disclose individually identifiable health information, up to $50,000 fine and or imprisonment up to 1 year. Offenses committed under false pretenses, to a $100,000 fine, imprisonment up to 5 years. Offenses committed with the intent to sell, transfer, or use individually identifiable health information for commercial advantage, personal gain, or malicious harm, up to $250,000 fine, and imprisonment up to 10 years. So as you can see, that these penalties are very severe, so it's not a good idea to get around HIPAA. What's the HIPAA privacy rule? Took effect on April 14th of 2003. Its goals are to protect the privacy of health information by limiting its access by others, and to provide the individual with more rights to access their own PHI. What are the components of the HIPAA privacy rule? High-Tech via ARA, which was authorized in 2009, made the following amendments to the HIPAA privacy rule: added additional requirements pertaining to business associates and subcontractors, added protections related to the protection of deceased individuals' PHI, required facilities to issue and promote notices of privacy practices, required facilities to have policies concerning the sale of PHI, instituted the minimum necessary requirement, meaning that only the minimum amount of information necessary to perform business can be shared, required hospitals to have policies regarding the use, sharing, or disclosure of PHI, required hospitals to maintain the privacy of student immunization records, establish limits on marketing and fundraising in the healthcare arena, and increase the penalties for noncompliance, as well as increase the degree of enforcement. The HIPAA privacy rules set a federal floor of privacy regulations that all states must adhere to. These regulations affect providers, healthcare clearinghouses, and health plans. Who does HIPAA apply to, and what does it protect? Covered entities, which are hospitals, pharmacies, physician practices, health plans, and healthcare clearinghouses and their employees. Business associates, their workforce, and their subcontractors. Business associates are people or organizations that act on behalf of a covered entity. Protected health information, or PHI, is protected under HIPAA. PHI is defined as individual identifiable health information in any form that identifies the person, relates to that person's health condition, and is held or transmitted by a covered entity or a business associate. De-identified information is not subject to the HIPAA privacy rule. Other key terms dealing with HIPAA: disclosure, divulging, releasing, or disseminating outside information about an identifiable person by a CE or BA to an entity or a person outside the entity holding the information. Use, sharing, application, utilization, or analysis of individually identifiable information within a CE or BA that is holding the information. Request, asking for all or part of a person's PHI. Treatment, payment, and operations, or TPO. The functions of a CE necessary for it to remain in business. TPO, what does it mean? Treatment, providing, coordinating, or managing healthcare or healthcare-related services. Payment, billing, claims management, claim collection, review of medical necessity of care, utilization review, etc. Operations, quality improvement, legal and auditing functions, customer service, etc. The Notice of Privacy Practices. This explains how PHI will be used and disclosed, explains the rights of the individual. Healthcare providers must make this notice available on the first encounter, and it must be posted in a prominent place, including on the provider's website if it exists. HIPAA and HITECH outline the required elements. Receipt must be acknowledged by the individual. Consent allows the use and disclosure of PHI for TPO. It is an optional document, and it must be permitted to revoke consent. Authorization is written permission for a specific disclosure. HIPAA requires certain elements on the authorization form. Psychotherapy and behavioral health notes follow separate HIPAA restrictions. Uses and disclosures are required without authorization if access or accounting of disclosures requested by the individual and Health and Human Services investigation, review, or enforcement action. Authorization. Uses and disclosures may be permitted without authorization if it is required by law. It is for public health activities. The record deals with the victim of abuse, neglect, or domestic violence. It is for healthcare oversight activities. The record is to be used for judicial or administrative proceedings. The record is to be used for law enforcement purposes. If it deals with decedent. The record deals with cadaveric eye, organ, or tissue donation. The record is to be used for research. The person the record deals with is considered a threat to health or safety. Workers' compensation. And finally, specialized government functions. Redisclosure involves PHI created by and received from another entity. Under HIPAA, redisclosure may be allowed to facilitate patient care. Information is only disclosed after attempting to obtain records from the originating facility. Includes only the information contained within the designated record set, or DRS. Commercial uses and disclosures. Marketing is communications about a product or service that encourages its purchase or use. Use or disclosure of PHI for marketing purposes generally requires an authorization. Marketing activities that may not require an authorization occur face-to-face with an individual and involve gifts of nominal value. Fundraising refers to the activities initiated by a CE to generate money for its behalf or its benefit. CEs must include in the Notice of Privacy Practices a statement that PHI may be used for fundraising purposes. An option to opt out of fundraising programs must also be included. Prior authorization is required if the fundraiser targets individuals based on their diagnosis. Under HITECH, the opt-out feature can apply to either a single fundraiser or all future fundraisers held by a CE. Sale of PHI. Under HITECH, CEs cannot sell PHI without patient authorization unless it is being used for public health or research or treatment and operations. Patient must declare in the authorization whether the new owner of the PHI can exchange the information further. Minimum necessary. This states that employees should have access to only the minimum amount of information necessary to perform their jobs. This standard applies to CEs, and as a rule, a general health set, which is PHI with certain direct identifiers removed, is used. If the limited data set definition is inadequate, the CE can revert to amount needed to accomplish intended purpose. The HIPAA privacy rule provides individuals with the right to access their PHI. Individuals may also request amendments, accounting of disclosures, confidential communications, and restrictions, as well as complain of privacy rule violations. Individual right of access. Individual can access one's own PHI contained in a designated record set. There are exceptions to access, for example, psychotherapy notes or information compiled for civil or criminal actions. CE may require the request be done in writing. The CE must respond within 30 days of the receival of the request. Per high-tech, CEs with electronic health record systems must make data available in electronic form. A reasonable fee may be imposed on requests. Individual right to request amendment. Individual has the right to request an amendment or an alteration to the protected health information. CE may require the request to be done in writing. HIPAA provides reasons why a request may be declined. For example, if it contains factually incorrect information, a timely response to the request is required. HIPAA also provides a process for denial of amendment requests. Individuals have the right to know about instances where their PHI has been disclosed. The accounting of disclosures includes date of disclosure, the name and address of the person who received the information, and a brief statement of the purpose. Timely response required. The first accounting within a 12-month period is free. Must account for all disclosures occurring within the last 3 years. These are exceptions to the accounting of disclosures rule. Confidential communications. The opportunity to request the communications of PHI be rerouted to an alternative location. Example, a woman who is seeking treatment for domestic violence may want their PHI to be at their workplace. Right to request restrictions. Individuals may request restrictions on uses and disclosures of PHI to carry out TPO. Covered entity does not have to agree to the restriction. Must document and abide by request if covered entities agrees to it, unless and until terminated. Right to complain. Notice of privacy practices must inform individuals of the right to complain at CE level as well as to the Department of Health and Human Services. Contact information is also required to be included. What's a breach? Per HIPAA, a breach is an unauthorized acquisition, access, use, or disclosure of PHI which compromises the security or privacy of such information. Under a few circumstances, unauthorized access may not be considered a breach, such as the recipient would not be reasonably able to retain information, unintentional breach of PHI in good faith, or inadvertent disclosure by an individual at one CE to another CE, in which the information is not further used or disclosed. Breach notification. Breaches are deemed to have been discovered when the breach is first known. Individuals should be notified within 60 days. If more than 9 individuals are affected, it's recommended to use web postings or the use of media. If more than 500 individuals are affected, you have to report the breach to the media, and you must also notify the Secretary of HHS. Possible to use an online breach reporting system. Individuals must be informed about what occurred, including the date of breach and the date of discovery, types of unsecured PHI involved, steps the individual may take to protect themselves, entity steps to prevent future breaches, and contact information so individuals can ask questions and receive updates. HIPAA covered entities and BAs are subject to HHS regulations. Non-HIPAA covered entities are subject to Federal Trade Commission regulations. This includes PHR vendors. Research is a public interest and benefit authorization exception. However, the IRB or the Privacy Board must approve variations of authorization requirement. Authorization may appear in one of the following forms: standalone, compound, conditioned and unconditioned, altered, or waived. HIPAA establishes a federal floor of privacy requirements. However, state laws contrary to HIPAA may be enforced if they are either more stringent or fulfill specific purposes enumerated in HIPAA. High-tech amendments to the enforcement regulations. HHS can contract with a private entity to perform random audits, no longer complaint-driven only. State attorneys can bring civil actions in federal court representing citizens affected by violations. Individuals can be individually prosecuted. Recommendations for compensating individuals harmed by HIPAA violations. The HIPAA security rule took effect on April 21st, 2005. Goal was to establish security standards and safeguards specific to electronic PHI. Requires covered entities to ensure the integrity and confidentiality of ePHI. Integrity refers to the lack of alteration or destruction in an unauthorized manner. Protects ePHI that is created, maintained, transmitted, or received by a covered entity. Confidentiality refers to not making this information available to unauthorized persons. The HIPAA security rule applies to covered healthcare providers, health plans, and healthcare clearinghouses, as well as to business associates and their subcontractors. This rule is enforced by the Office of Civil Rights. It is designed to be flexible, scalable, and technology neutral. What is ePHI? ePHI is PHI maintained or transmitted in electronic form. For example, PHI stored on tapes, discs, optical discs, hard drives, servers, over the internet, or on private networks is considered ePHI. PHI stored in voicemail messages, paper-to-paper faxes, and copy machines is not considered ePHI. Most standards contain implementation specifications. Required, or are, in brackets, means must be implemented. Addressable, or A in brackets, means that they can be implemented as the rule states, or in an alternative manner, or documented that the risk is non-existent or negligible. However, you cannot ignore addressable information specifications. Under the general requirements, a CE must ensure the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of all ePHI created, received, maintained, or transmitted. Protect the security or integrity of ePHI from reasonably anticipated threats or hazards. Protect against reasonably anticipated ePHI uses or disclosures not permitted or required. And ensure workforce compliance with the security rule. When considering the flexibility of a security plan, many factors should be involved. For example, the size, complexity, and capabilities of the CE, the security capabilities of the hardware and software, the cost of security measures, and likelihood of risks to the PHI. HHS recommends the following security process: assess current security risks and gaps, develop an implementation plan, implement solutions, document decisions, and reassess periodically. Risk analysis. Covered entities and BAs should utilize risk analysis to decide which security measures to implement. Financial analysis should also be used to measure the cost of compliance. There are 5 categories of safeguards: administrative safeguards, physical safeguards, technical safeguards, organizational safeguards, policies, procedures, and documentation. We'll go over each one of these later. Security rule requires that a continuing review of the reasonableness and appropriateness of the security plan be conducted. This allows this plan to be modified as needed. The administrative safeguards are divided into security management process, assigned security responsibility, workforce security, information access management, security awareness training, security incident reporting, contingency plan, evaluation, and BA contracts and other assignments. So, 9 sections. Security management process. This deals with implementing policies and procedures to prevent, detect, contain, and correct security violations. Risk analysis. Accurate, thorough assessment of risks and vulnerabilities that threaten the security of ePHI. Risk management. Implement security measures sufficient to reduce risks and vulnerabilities to a reasonable, appropriate level. Sanction policy. Apply appropriate sanctions for noncompliance. Information system activity review. Implement procedures to regularly review system activity, such as audit logs, access reports, and security incident tracking reports. Identify a security individual to develop and implement security policies and procedures to manage and supervise the use of security measures, as well as the conduct of personnel involved with security. There are no implementation specifications, and this is required. Workforce security. Implement policies and procedures to ensure appropriate access to EPHI. Authorization and supervision. Implement procedures to authorize or supervise personnel working with EPHI. Clearance procedures. Implement procedures to help ensure appropriate access of personnel. Termination procedures. Implement procedures for ending access to EPHI in the event a worker leaves, changes role, or is terminated. Information access management. Implement policies and procedures authorizing access to EPHI. Isolate clearinghouse functions. If a healthcare clearinghouse is part of a larger organization, the clearinghouse must implement policies and procedures that protects the larger organization from accessing the clearinghouse's EPHI. Access implementation. Implement policies and procedures for granting access to EPHI, for example, through access to a workstation, process, transaction, or program. Access establishment and modification. Implement procedures that establish, document, review, and modify a user's right of access to a workstation, transaction, process, or program based on access authorization procedures. Security awareness training. Implement a security awareness training program for all employees. Security reminders. Periodic security updates and reminders for the workforce. Protection from malicious software. Procedures for guarding against detecting and reporting malicious software. Login monitoring. Procedures for monitoring login attempts. Password management. Procedures for creating, changing, and securing passwords. Security incident procedures. Implement policies and procedures to address security incidents. Response and reporting includes the following provisions: identify and respond to suspected or known security incidents, mitigate harmful effects of security incidents that are known, and document security incidents and their outcomes. Contingency plan. Establish policies and procedures for responding to an emergency or other occurrence, fire, vandalism, system failure, natural disaster that damages systems containing EPHI. Data backup plan. Establish and implement procedures to create and maintain retrievable exact copies of EPHI. Disaster recovery. Establish procedures to record data after loss. Emergency mode operations. Establish procedures to enable continuation of critical business procedures for EPHI security while operating in emergency mode. Testing and revision procedures. Implement procedures for periodic testing and revision of contingency plans. Applications and data criticality analysis. Access relative criticality of specific applications and data in support of other contingency plan components. Evaluation. Perform periodic evaluations in response to operational changes affecting the security of EPHI that establish the extent to which an entity's security policies and procedures meet HIPAA requirements. No implementation specifications, and this is required. Business associate contracts and other agreements. A covered entity may permit a BA to create, receive, maintain, or transmit EPHI on the covered entity's behalf only if the covered entity receives satisfactory assurances the BA will appropriately safeguard the information, and these must be documented through a written contract or other agreement. Physical safeguards. Facility access controls, workstation use, workstation security, and device and media controls. Facility access controls. Implement policies and procedures to limit access to electronic information systems in the facilities that house them while allowing authorized access of these systems. Contingency operations. Establish procedures allowing facility access in support of restoring lost data under data recovery plan and emergency mode operations planned during an emergency. Facility security plan. To safeguard the facility and the equipment therein from unauthorized physical access, tampering, and theft. Access control and validation procedures. to control or invalidate a person's access to facilities based on role or function, including visitor control and control of access to software programs. Maintenance records to document repairs and modifications to the physical components of a facility that are security related, for example, hardware, walls, doors, or locks. Workstation use. Implement policies and procedures that specify the proper functions to be performed, the way those functions are to be performed, and the physical attributes of the surroundings of a specific workstation that can access EPHI. No implementation standards, and it's required. Workstation security. Implement physical safeguards for all workstations that access EPHI to restrict access to authorized users. No implementation specifications, and this is required. Device and media controls. Implement policies and procedures that govern the receipt or removal of hardware and electronic media containing EPHI in and out of a facility, as well as the movement of items within the facility. Disposal addresses the final disposition of EPHI and/or the hardware or electronic media on which it is stored. Media reuse. Implement procedures for removal of EPHI from electronic media before the media is made available for reuse. Accountability. Maintain a record of the movements of hardware and electronic media and any person responsible. Data backup and storage. Create a retrievable exact copy of EPHI when needed before movement of equipment. Technical safeguards. Access control, audit controls, integrity, person or entry authorization, transmission security. Access controls. Implement technical policies and procedures for electronic information systems that maintain EPHI to allow access only to those persons of software programs that have been granted access rights. Unique user identification. Assign a unique name and/or number for identifying and tracking user identity. Emergency access procedures. Establish procedures for obtaining necessary EPHI during an emergency. Automatic log off. Implement electronic procedures that terminate an electronic session after a predetermined time of inactivity. Encryption and decryption. Implement a mechanism to encrypt and decrypt EPHI. Audit controls. Implement hardware, software, or procedural mechanisms that record or examine activity in information systems that contain EPHI. No implementation systems required. Specifications, and it is required. Integrity. Implement policies and procedures to protect EPHI from improper alteration or destruction. Mechanism to authenticate EPHI. Implement electronic mechanisms to confirm that EPHI has not been altered or destroyed in an improper manner. Person or entity authentication. Implement policies to ensure the validity of a person or vendor seeking access is the one claimed. No implementation specifications, and it is required. Transmission security. Implement technical security measures to guard against unauthorized access of EPHI transmitted over an electronic communications network. Integrity controls. Implement security measures to ensure that electronically transmitted EPHI is not improperly modified. Encryption. Implement a mechanism to encrypt EPHI when deemed appropriate. Organizational requirements. Business associate contracts and other arrangements and group health plans. Business associate contracts. Contract must provide for BA compliance and assure subcontractors that create, receive, maintain, or transmit EPHI on behalf of the BA agree to comply by entering into a contract or agreement. Must report to the CE or any security incident that it is aware of, including breaches of unsecured PHI. Other arrangements. Covered entity complies if it has another arrangement that meets the requirements specified in that's U.S. Federal Code. Business associate contracts with subcontractors. Requirements between a covered entity and a business associate also require contracts or arrangements between a business associate and a subcontractor. Group health plans. Requires plans sponsored reasonably and appropriately to safeguard the confidentiality and integrity of EPHI. Plan document. Group health plan documents must require sponsors to implement administrative, technical and physical safeguards to protect the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of EPHI that it creates, maintains, or receives on behalf of the group plan. Separation of EPHI is supported by security measures, and it must ensure that any agent to whom it provides information agrees to implement security measures to protect information and report to the health plan any security breaches that occur. Policies, procedures, and documentation. Implement policies and procedures for compliance with the standards, implementation specifications, and other requirements. Policies and procedures may be changed at any time as long as the changes are documented and maintained. Requires maintenance of policies and procedures documented to comply with the security rule in written form. Time limits, retain documentation of procedures from the time of creation or when it was last in effect. Make documentation available to those responsible for implementing policies and procedures. Review documentation periodically and update as needed. HIPAA Security Officer designation. Required per an implementation specification in the Administrative Safeguard Standards. Individual must be responsible for overseeing the information security program. Title of Chief Security Officer or Chief Security Officer may comprise a portion or 100% of the worker's duties. Depends on the size of the organization as well as the amount of health information technology used. Penalty process. Violations of the HIPAA security rule undergo a penalty process. Begins with a complaint, although per high-tech, random audits may be performed. If investigation concludes non-compliance, the following actions may be taken. Goal of voluntary compliance, otherwise corrective action or resolution agreement. Non-cooperation can result in civil monetary penalties. If deemed a potentially criminal action, case may be referred to the Department of Justice. So these are severe. You don't want to end up here. Disaster planning. Part of administrative and physical safeguards. Should be part of the BA and CE risk assessment. HHS and AHIMA have published toolkits for use by CEs and BAs in the event of a natural or man-made disaster, like terrorism threats. Any questions? Okay, that's the end of the PowerPoint.